A humble governess brought a plea to the Duke, and her courage broke the silence of his cold heart. The autumn market sprawled beneath a pewter sky, its canvas stalls fluttering like wounded birds. Eleanor Finch moved between the vendors with practiced grace, her moss-green dress drawing few eyes. A governess was invisible as society had long since determined. The child beside her, Clara Montague, clutched a small parcel of dried herbs, her hazel eyes bright with innocent delight. "Miss Eleanor," Clara whispered, tugging at the seam of her governess's sleeve, "shall we purchase the honeysuckle for the house? The yellow flowers would brighten the parlor so." Eleanor smiled, pressing the small coins from her meager allowance into the vendor's weathered palm, but her attention fractured as she heard the unmistakable voice of Lady Agatha cutting through the market bustle. "Surely you do not permit the child to associate so freely with the lower merchants," Lady Agatha remarked to her companion, her words brittle as autumn glass. "A governess of doubtful origin cannot shield her from such exposure." The accusation hung in the air like frost. Eleanor felt the weight descend upon her shoulders, the old familiar pressure of suspicion that haunted every woman of her station. Doubtful origin. As though her education, her restraint, her unwavering devotion to Clara's welfare counted for nothing against the accident of her birth. Clara's small hand tightened in hers, sensing the shift in the world around them. That evening, in the schoolroom of the Montague residence, Eleanor sat beside Clara as the child bent over her copybook. The girl's script was precise, her mind sharp, but lately Eleanor had noticed the trembling at the margins of the child's composure. A shadow seemed to follow Clara from room to room, whispering accusations that belonged to no one in particular, yet to everyone at once. "Why does Mama say you are wicked?" Clara asked suddenly, her pen suspended above the paper. Eleanor's breath caught. She set down her needlework with deliberate steadiness. "Your mother has never spoken such words to me, Clara." "Not to you," Clara whispered. "To Lady Agatha. I heard them in the corridor. They said you were familiar. That you encourage impropriety, that I should not trust you." The words struck like blows, yet Eleanor's face remained composed. She rose and walked to the window, where the autumn light fell in long amber bars across the floor. Behind her, the city stretched toward the distant hills, toward the grey stone fortress of Harborough Estate, where Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Harborough, dwelt in his measured, unyielding silence. Eleanor had glimpsed him only twice, once at a church gathering, where his presence seemed to diminish the warmth of every candle, once in the street, where he moved past with the gravity of a man carrying kingdoms upon his shoulders. "Clara," Eleanor said, turning back to face the child, "there are moments when what is true must be spoken, even when the world would prefer silence. Do you understand?" Clara shook her head, confusion clouding her features. Eleanor knelt beside her, taking the small hands in her gloved ones. "You will come to understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to speak what is just, even when the cost seems unbearable." She did not yet know what courage would demand of her, but the seed had been planted, not by hope but by necessity. The whispers were intensifying. Lady Agatha's coldness had begun to infect the entire household. If nothing changed, if Eleanor remained silent, Clara would be poisoned by the same cruelty that had nearly consumed her own childhood. That night, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in her chamber, her hand moving across the parchment with a steadiness that belied the tempest in her heart. She wrote to the Duke a letter of plea, not demand, a prayer in ink and wax, sealed with a muted red seal that seemed to pulse with the weight of her desperation. She wrote of Clara's goodness. She wrote of the accusations, unfounded and vicious. She wrote of a child's worth transcending the prejudice of a frightened woman, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was committing an act of transgression. A governess did not write to dukes. A woman of her station did not presume to claim the ear of power. But Clara deserved more than silence, and Eleanor had finally understood that some things could not remain unspoken, no matter the cost. She held the sealed letter before the candlelight, watching the wax gleam like a promise or a confession. Tomorrow she would place it in his hands, and the world, as she knew it, would shatter. The morning arrived cold and reluctant, as if the season itself resisted Eleanor's intention. She had spent the night rehearsing the impossible, how to approach a man whose silence was as formidable as castle walls, whose position elevated him beyond the reach of governess pleas. Yet necessity had become a fierceness in her blood. The Duke's residence occupied the eastern corner of the city, a structure of sober stone and small, watchful windows. Eleanor had learned, through careful inquiry of the servants, that he spent Tuesday mornings reviewing his accounts in the library, a fact that presented perhaps her sole opportunity. She wore her best dress, the moss-green wool preserved for occasions of consequence. Her gloves had been cleaned until they seemed to glow. The sealed letter rested against her heart, wrapped in tissue to prevent its edges from betraying her through the fabric. The household steward, an elderly man named Pemberton, regarded her with evident surprise as she ascended the library steps. "Miss Finch," he said, blocking the threshold with the courtesy of his station, "the Duke does not receive callers at this hour. Perhaps if you were to submit a letter—" "I have come to submit it personally, Mr. Pemberton," Eleanor replied, her voice steady though her pulse thundered in her neck. "I would be most grateful for a moment of His Grace's time. It concerns a matter of grave family concern." Something in her tone, some note of genuine distress, caused the steward to pause. After a moment he withdrew. Eleanor waited in the corridor, her hands clasped so tightly that her gloved fingers turned white. The October light streamed through a tall window, illuminating dust that seemed to move like sentient things, anxious and trembling. The library door opened. The Duke stood framed in the doorway, and Eleanor understood in that instant why the world accorded him such deference. It was not merely his height or the cut of his grey coat, though both commanded attention. It was the quality of his regard, a gaze that seemed to contain entire seasons of observation, waiting and judgment held perpetually in suspension. "Miss Finch," he said, and his voice was precisely as she had imagined it, measured, with the weight of infrequently used authority. "You are the governess employed by the Montague household." It was not a question. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. "I am, Your Grace," she replied, and dropped into a curtsy that seemed to take an eternity to complete. When she rose, she found his eyes had not left her. "I have come to request your consideration of a matter concerning the welfare of Miss Clara Montague. I would not presume upon your time were the circumstances less dire." Something flickered across his features, not quite approval, but perhaps a recognition of sincerity. He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the library. The room was vast, lined with leather volumes whose spines spoke of histories and philosophies. A fire burned low in the hearth. The Duke's desk held scattered papers, an inkwell, and a single candle that had burned nearly to its end, suggesting he had been at his work for hours before dawn. "Speak," he commanded, though the word held no harshness. He moved to stand near the window, the morning light rendering his features into sharp relief. In profile, Eleanor glimpsed something softer beneath the severity, a mouth that had perhaps once known how to smile, before duty had taught it otherwise. Eleanor withdrew the letter from her bodice. The act was unconsciously intimate, and she saw his eyes register the movement with what might have been surprise. "I cannot adequately convey in words, Your Grace, what I have witnessed," she began. "Miss Clara is a child of remarkable goodness, intelligent, gentle, and deeply loyal to those who show her kindness. Yet her own mother, and more particularly Lady Agatha Montague, have begun to spread accusations regarding my character that are wholly without foundation." "What sort of accusations?" The Duke's tone remained neutral, but his posture had shifted. Something in his frame suggested he was attending to her with an intensity that few possessed. "Implications of impropriety, Your Grace. Suggestions that I encourage familiarity beneath the dignity of our station. Such whispers, I fear, will soon poison the child's understanding of innocence itself. She will learn that trust is weaponized, that love is suspect, that a woman's worth is eternally fragile and subject to the judgment of those who wish to diminish her." Eleanor pressed forward, her voice gathering strength. "The child deserves to know that there are those who will defend her, not because it is convenient, but because it is right. I have written to you in the hope that your position and character might stand as a bulwark against this cruelty." She extended the letter toward him. For a moment he did not take it. His storm-grey eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her wonder if he could perceive not merely her features, but the truths beneath them. When he finally accepted the letter, his fingers brushed hers. A contact so brief it might have been imagined, yet it reverberated through her as though she had been struck by lightning. "You are," he said slowly, "either remarkable in your courage or foolish in your desperation. I have not yet determined which." "Perhaps, Your Grace, they are the same thing," Eleanor replied softly. A sound emerged from him, not quite laughter, but something akin to it. A rumble of surprise from deep in his chest, as if he had encountered something unexpected in a world grown predictable. "You will hear from me, Miss Finch," he said, and turned the sealed letter over in his hands. "In the matter of Miss Clara, and in certain other considerations, you may trust that I do not remain unmoved." Eleanor understood she was dismissed, yet something in his final words suggested that more than a governess's plea had been received. As she departed the library, she heard him call out once more, her name spoken with a deliberation that suggested it had been placed, carefully, into his memory. Behind her, as Pemberton escorted her down the stone stairs, Eleanor did not see the Duke return to his desk. She did not witness him break the seal of her letter, with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly, or see how his features transformed as he read her words, as if something long frozen within him had finally begun its thaw. The door to the library closed with finality, yet the silence was broken now, and neither of them could return to what they had been before. 3 days passed without word from Harborough. Eleanor moved through the Montague household, as though walking through water, every gesture careful, every breath measured. She remained vigilant to the shifting temperament of those around her, knowing that the Duke's silence could mean everything or nothing at all. Lady Agatha seemed restless, her usually composed features marked by a subtle tension. She had begun to make remarks more frequently, sharp observations about Eleanor's suitability, veiled suggestions that the governess had become too familiar with Clara, comments that fell into conversation like stones thrown into still water. On the 4th morning, Eleanor sat with Clara in the schoolroom, their lesson focused upon French grammar and the careful embroidery of correspondence. The child's needlework was precise but trembling, as if her small hands carried forward the anxiety of the household itself. "Eleanor," Clara asked, setting aside her needlework, "do you truly believe that good people are always protected? That truth makes one safe?" Eleanor's throat tightened. She took the child's hands in her own, noting how small they were, how fragile the bones beneath the skin. "Clara, there is a distinction between truth and safety," Eleanor said carefully. "Truth is sometimes dangerous. The brave do not always escape unscathed, but there is a nobility in speaking what is right, even when the world would prefer our silence. Do you understand?" "I do not wish to be brave," Clara whispered. "I wish to be loved." The words broke something open in Eleanor's chest. She drew the child close, inhaling the scent of her hair, honeysuckle and innocence, and allowed herself a moment of despair. What had she done writing to a stranger, making promises she could not keep? What if her courage had only deepened Clara's vulnerability? The knock came at the door with deliberate formality. A footman entered, his manner suggesting gravity. "Miss Finch, you are to attend Lady Montague in the drawing-room at once." Eleanor's heart descended into the depths of her stomach. A summons from Clara's mother at this particular moment could mean only that the Duke's silence had broken in unexpected fashion. She smoothed her dress, kissed Clara's forehead in silent reassurance, and departed. Lady Montague sat rigid upon her chair, her features sculpted from ice. Yet it was not anger that dominated her expression. It was something more complex, uncertainty perhaps, or the grudging acknowledgement of a power she could not contradict. "Miss Finch," Lady Montague began, her voice precise but strained, "I have this morning received a letter from the Duke of Harborough. He expresses himself most firmly regarding the character and fitness of your continued employment within this household. He has, in fact, suggested that any further aspersions cast upon your reputation would be considered a grave discourtesy to himself personally." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. She steadied herself through force of will alone. "Furthermore," Lady Montague continued, her jaw tight, "His Grace has indicated his intention to take a personal interest in Miss Clara's education and social development. He has arranged for her to receive instruction in French and deportment from Madame Clarice, a most renowned instructor, at his own expense. This is naturally an extraordinary honor, though I confess myself uncertain as to the propriety of such arrangements." Eleanor understood then what had transpired. The Duke had not merely responded to her plea. He had moved with the swift, absolute authority of his position to remake the situation entirely. He had transformed Eleanor from a woman of questionable standing into someone worthy of his protection. And in doing so, he had demonstrated that no whisper, no insinuation, no carefully orchestrated cruelty could withstand the weight of his regard. "Your Ladyship," Eleanor said, executing a careful curtsy, "I am grateful for His Grace's generosity toward Miss Clara. Her development has always been my foremost concern." "Yes," Lady Montague said coldly, "clearly it has. You may return to the schoolroom. Inform Clara of the arrangement. She is to present herself at Harborough Estate on Friday next for her first lesson." Eleanor turned to leave, but Lady Montague's voice called her back. "Miss Finch," she said, and now her tone carried something almost like reluctant respect. It appears that the Duke does not share society's customary judgments regarding women of modest origin. He seems to perceive virtues where others perceive only presumption. I confess I do not understand it, but I am constrained to acknowledge his judgment. Eleanor did not reply. She merely curtsied once more and departed, her legs carrying her with the grace of training, even as her mind spiraled with the impossible implications of what had occurred. That evening, as Eleanor prepared Clara for bed, the child asked softly, "Did you speak to the Duke? About me?" Eleanor hesitated. To lie would be to teach the child that truth could be hidden, that courage could be denied. "I did, my dear. I asked him to see your goodness and to help protect you from those who would diminish it." "And he heard you?" Clara's eyes widened with something like wonder. "He heard me," Eleanor confirmed. "More than that, he acted upon what he heard. That, Clara, is what happens when a person of power chooses to listen to the voice of truth. The world changes." After the child slept, Eleanor sat in her small chamber and permitted herself to weep. Not tears of joy, though gratitude moved through her like a benediction. Rather, she wept from the overwhelming realization that someone had finally witnessed her, truly witnessed her, and had deemed her worthy of his intervention. The Duke had read her letter, and in reading it he had seen not a presumptuous governess, but a woman of courage and moral clarity. He had broken his own silence to defend her. And now Eleanor understood with absolute certainty something had shifted between them, something that could never be returned to its former state. The seal had been broken, the silence had been shattered. The world would never be quite the same. Friday arrived with the grey weight of approaching winter. The harbour estate rose from the landscape like a declaration of permanence. Stone walls that had witnessed centuries, windows that gazed outward with the composure of absolute authority. Eleanor accompanied Clara through the iron gates, her heart executing a rhythm that matched the horse's hooves upon the gravel drive. The child clutched Eleanor's hand with a pressure that spoke of nervousness tempered by anticipation. Madame Clarice, they had learned, was a widow of some renown, a French woman whose instruction had shaped the deportment of the county's most respectable daughters. Her presence at the Duke's residence suggested something unprecedented, that he intended to elevate Clara's station through education and association. Yet it was not Madame Clarice who greeted them in the great hall. Instead, the Duke himself descended the marble staircase with a measured pace that suggested this encounter had been deliberately orchestrated. He wore charcoal grey, his cuff buttons catching the light like fragments of starlight. His storm-grey eyes moved first to Clara, assessing, then to Eleanor, and in that regard she felt a tremor pass through her that had nothing to do with fear. "Miss Clara," the Duke said, his voice resonating through the hall with a gentleness that Eleanor had not anticipated from a man of his severity, "you are most welcome to Harborough. Madame Clarice awaits you in the morning room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Ashford, will escort you there. I trust you will apply yourself with diligence to your studies." Clara executed a curtsy that would have pleased even Lady Agatha. "Your Grace, I am most grateful for your generosity. I shall endeavour to prove worthy of your confidence." "You are already worthy," the Duke replied, and something in his tone suggested he was not merely addressing the child. His eyes shifted once more to Eleanor. "Miss Finch, perhaps you would permit me a moment of your time. There is a matter of some importance regarding Miss Clara's progress that I wish to discuss." Eleanor's breath caught. To be alone with the Duke, without the child's presence as a buffer against propriety, it was the very impropriety that Lady Agatha had accused her of encouraging. Yet to refuse would be to suggest that his invitation was inappropriate, which would itself be a transgression. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady though her pulse thundered in her ears. He led her not to the library where they had first spoken, but to a smaller room, his private study. The space was intimate without being familiar, lined with maps and documents, dominated by a desk of polished mahogany. A fire burned with controlled intensity, casting shadows that seemed to deepen the gravity of his features. "You have created quite a disturbance," he said, gesturing for her to sit. He remained standing, positioning himself near the window in that characteristic manner she had come to recognize. As if the landscape beyond held secrets he consulted regularly. "I regret any inconvenience, Your Grace," Eleanor began carefully. "I acted out of concern for—" "You acted out of courage," he interrupted, and his voice carried a note that made her understand he was not criticizing her. "A quality so rare in my experience that I confess I did not at first recognize it. When I read your letter, Miss Finch, I perceived something that has been absent from my household for many years. genuine moral clarity, unadorned, unencumbered by the calculations of social advancement. Eleanor did not know how to respond. She waited. Your intervention on behalf of the child has had consequences beyond what you may have anticipated, the Duke continued. Lady Agatha has, naturally, become considerably less vocal in her criticisms. Your reputation, I believe, is now secured. But I wonder if you comprehend the full significance of what you have accomplished. He turned to face her directly, and Eleanor saw in his features something that resembled sadness, a deep, habitual loneliness that no amount of rank could ameliorate. You have taught me something I had believed myself incapable of learning, he said quietly. That silence is not always wisdom, that there are matters of sufficient importance to warrant the risk of transgression. I have lived for many years believing that my station obligated me to remain unmoved by the suffering of those beneath me in rank. Your letter demonstrated the failure of that philosophy. Eleanor rose from her chair. She could not remain seated while he spoke with such vulnerability. Your Grace, I wrote to you not as a supplicant before power, but as one human appealing to another. I believed you possessed the capacity for justice, even if society had encouraged you to suppress it. You believed correctly, he said, and moved closer. The distance between them diminished to something that made the air between them seem to vibrate with consequence. And now I find myself in the peculiar position of being observed by my own household with considerable interest. The servants whisper about why the Duke has taken such an interest in a child's governess, why he ensured her protection with such deliberate firmness. What do they conclude? Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. That His Grace has found something to admire, the Duke replied, and that perhaps, after years of emotional winter, he shows signs of thaw. He did not touch her, yet Eleanor felt the warmth of his proximity as though his hands had found hers. The moment stretched between them, fragile as glass, dangerous as truth unguarded. A knock at the door shattered the spell. A footman entered with a letter upon a silver tray. Your Grace, a messenger has arrived from the city with urgent correspondence regarding the estate accounts. The matter requires your immediate attention. The Duke accepted the letter with visible reluctance, breaking the seal with a methodical precision that seemed to cost him effort. As he read, Eleanor watched his expression transform. Something dark moved across his features, concern perhaps, or the weight of responsibility, asserting its claim upon him once more. Miss Finch, he said, his tone returning to its customary formality, you will remain at Harborough for Miss Clara's instruction sessions. I will arrange for a carriage to bring you twice weekly. It will be more efficient and will spare you the journey through the city streets. It was an excuse, Eleanor understood, a means of legitimizing her presence within his household through the pretense of convenience. As you wish, Your Grace, she replied, and felt the delicate threads of connection between them strengthen even as he withdrew behind the walls of his authority. When she returned to the morning room, Clara was executing a perfect plea under Madame Clarice's tutelage, her small body aligned with grace that had been impossible mere weeks before. The child glowed with the transformation that confidence bestowed. As Eleanor watched, the Duke appeared in the doorway, and she saw him observe Clara with an expression so tender that it seemed to crack the severity that typically governed his features. For a moment, Eleanor glimpsed the man beneath the Duke, the one who had known love once, who had perhaps never ceased mourning its loss. The door closed. He was gone. Yet his presence lingered like perfume, like the ghost of something beautiful beginning to awaken. The weeks that followed established themselves with the rhythm of ritual. Tuesdays and Fridays became the architecture upon which Eleanor's existence was constructed. She would arrive at Harborough in the late afternoon, her moss-green dress exchanged for her more formal grey, her hair arranged with additional care that she would not permit herself to examine too closely. Clara's transformation was extraordinary. Under Madame Clarice's instruction, the child had developed a grace that seemed to elevate her entire being. Yet more significant than the perfection of her curtsy was the restoration of her confidence, the understanding that she was worthy of protection, of education, of a future that extended beyond the narrow confines of Lady Agatha's disapproval. The Duke maintained a careful distance that was itself a form of intimacy. He would appear during Clara's lessons, observing with the gravity of a man studying something precious. When he spoke to Eleanor, it was always in the context of Clara's progress, her advancement, her future prospects. Yet beneath these practical observations, Eleanor perceived the current of something far deeper, a longing expressed through constraint, an affection channeled through propriety. On the fourth Friday, as Eleanor waited while Clara completed her final exercise, the Duke entered the morning room alone. "Miss Clara has demonstrated exceptional progress," he said, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic gesture. "Madame Clarice believes she will be fully prepared for the assembly season. When she is presented to society, there will be no question of her quality." "You intend to present her yourself?" Eleanor asked, understanding the significance of what he was suggesting. For a duke to sponsor a child who bore no relation to him would elevate her standing beyond what any governess could accomplish. "I do," he replied, "unless there is some objection from her family." "Lady Montague will not object to such an honor," Eleanor said softly, though she may struggle to comprehend it. "As do I," the Duke admitted, and now his storm-grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "I struggle to comprehend many things of late. I find myself departing from the orderly patterns that have governed my existence. I find myself," he paused, seeming to battle with himself, "altered by circumstances I did not anticipate." Eleanor's hands trembled. She clasped them together, a gesture that was becoming almost habitual. "Your Grace, I must confess that I too have been altered. What began as a plea for justice has become something far more complicated. I find myself attending Harborough not merely for Clara's sake, but for—" She stopped, unable to complete the admission. "For mine," he finished quietly. "Say it, Eleanor. I have earned the right to hear it spoken plainly." The use of her given name struck her like a physical blow. No one of his station had ever spoken her name with such intimacy, such deliberate intention. It was a transgression, and yet it was also the most honest thing that had occurred between them. "For yours," she whispered, "though it is impossible, though it transgresses every boundary of propriety and reason, though it will end as it must in sorrow for us both." The Duke moved toward her, and Eleanor thought for a moment that he might touch her, might break through the careful walls they had constructed, but instead he stopped at a distance that was both safer and infinitely more painful. "I have spent 15 years in silence, Eleanor," he said, his voice raw with emotion held barely in check. 15 years observing the world from behind walls of my own construction. When you appeared in my library, when you spoke truth without deference or calculation, something within me that I believed dead stirred back to life. It is a resurrection that terrifies and exhilarates me in equal measure. "We cannot," Eleanor began, but he raised a hand. "I do not ask for the impossible," he said. "I ask only that you permit me to value you, that you allow me to ensure your security, your comfort, your future. When the time comes, when Clara is established, when propriety allows, I will speak more clearly. But until that moment I ask that you trust me, that you believe I would not place you in jeopardy." Eleanor felt tears trace down her cheeks. "The world will talk. They already talk. To be seen so frequently at Harborough." "Let them talk," the Duke said, and his voice held the absolute authority of his station. "I am the Duke of Harborough. My actions require no justification. And any who would suggest impropriety between myself and a woman of your evident virtue will find themselves facing my displeasure. Let that silence them." The door opened. Clara entered, flushed with the exertion of her exercises. She perceived Eleanor's tears and the Duke's proximity, and something in the child's expression suggested she understood far more than either adult had credited her with comprehending. "Your Grace," Clara said solemnly, Miss Eleanor is the best person I know. If you are kind to her as you have been to me, then I believe you must be kind to everyone truly." The Duke smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire countenance. "Your wisdom exceeds your years, Miss Clara. I shall endeavor to deserve such confidence." That evening, as Eleanor returned to the city in the Duke's carriage, she found a small parcel upon the seat beside her. Within lay a volume, a book of poetry bound in green leather, its pages marked with careful annotation. In the margin of one poem, a single sentence had been written in a hand she had come to recognize, "For the voice that broke my silence." Eleanor held the book to her heart as the carriage moved through the darkening streets, understanding that the Duke had spoken his truth in the only way he could, through words already written, through thoughts already distilled into their finest form. It was his language, the vocabulary of a man who had learned to express himself through restraint and carefully chosen symbols. She did not notice in the gathering dusk the figure who watched the carriage depart from the shadow of a doorway. Lady Agatha's expression was troubled, her mind calculating the implications of Eleanor's obvious distress and the Duke's unmistakable partiality. The whispers would change now. the speculation would intensify. And Eleanor, innocent of how greatly her fortune had shifted, pressed the book closer and allowed herself to hope, a dangerous indulgence in a world where class and propriety were the only laws that truly mattered. Winter descended upon the city with the finality of a pronouncement. The trees shed their remaining leaves and the streets became channels of wind that cut through even the heaviest garments. Eleanor had begun to move through the world with the sensation of living simultaneously in two dimensions, one where she remained the careful, circumspect governess, and another where she carried the Duke's book of poetry like a secret that burned against her heart. The arrangement of twice-weekly visits to Harborough had not escaped notice. The servants gossiped, the merchants observed. The ladies of society began to whisper with renewed intensity. Their speculation now focused not on Eleanor's impropriety with Clara, but on something far more scandalous, the possibility that the Duke himself had taken an improper interest in a woman of her station. Lady Montague approached the matter with the delicacy of someone handling an explosive device. "Miss Finch," she said one afternoon, her tone carefully neutral, "I have been asked by several acquaintances regarding the frequency of your visits to the Duke's residence. I trust there is nothing in these arrangements that might be construed as—" "As what, your ladyship?" Eleanor replied, her voice calm though her insides had become turbulent as storm-tossed seas. "The arrangement is for Miss Clara's instruction. The Duke has taken an interest in her welfare and education. Surely that is to be celebrated." "Naturally," Lady Montague said, though her eyes remained uncertain. "And yet a single woman attending a bachelor household with such regularity—" "The Duke's household staff numbers nearly 40 persons," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I am never alone with His Grace except in the company of either Miss Clara or Madame Clarice. If your ladyship finds the arrangement objectionable, I will certainly cease—" "No, no," Lady Montague said quickly, and Eleanor perceived the calculus behind her hesitation. The prestige of the Duke's patronage was too valuable to risk. "I merely wish to ensure that all proprieties were being observed. I have no doubt they are." Yet the weight of scrutiny had increased noticeably. Eleanor became acutely conscious of how her movements were observed, how her time at Harborough was documented and discussed. The very protection the Duke had offered her had become, paradoxically, a vulnerability. To be seen in his favor was to be marked, examined, judged by standards that were simultaneously more severe and more mercurial than those applied to other women. On the following Tuesday, Eleanor arrived at Harborough to find the Duke waiting for her in the entrance hall. His expression was grave, his features carved from shadow and concern. "Miss Clara has developed a fever," he said immediately. "Madame Clarice deemed it unwise to proceed with today's lessons. The child sleeps now, attended by the physician. She has asked for you repeatedly." Eleanor's heart contracted. She moved toward the staircase without awaiting further instruction. The Duke followed her, his presence seeming to fill the space around her with both comfort and urgency. Clara lay in a chamber adjacent to Madame Clarice's sitting room, the child's small form diminished beneath layers of quilted blankets. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, her eyes bright with the delirium of illness. When Eleanor entered, Clara's hands reached out with desperate urgency. "Eleanor," the child whispered, "you came. I knew you would come. Everyone leaves, but you always return." Eleanor took the small hands in her own, finding them burning with heat. She pressed her lips to the child's forehead, unsurprised to find the fever as severe as the physician's grave expression had suggested. "I am here, Clara," she murmured. "I will remain with you. You are safe." She turned to the Duke, who stood in the doorway with an expression of such tender concern that Eleanor's breath caught. "Your Grace, if you would permit it, I should like to remain until the fever breaks. I have some experience with illness. My own mother was a nurse before her marriage. I might be of service?" "Of course," the Duke replied. "Mrs. Ashford will prepare a chamber for you. You will want for nothing." The fever persisted for 3 days, 3 days during which Eleanor moved between states of terror and hope, with a constancy that seemed to strip away the last vestiges of propriety from her existence. She bathed Clara's forehead with cool water. She whispered encouragement and prayers. She sat through the endless nights, her hands holding the child's through the worst of the delirium. The Duke appeared throughout, bringing tea, checking her welfare, his presence a steady assurance that he would see this crisis through. On the second night, when Eleanor found herself weeping from exhaustion and fear, he sat beside her and spoke with quiet firmness about Clara's strength, about the resilience of children, about the certainty that dawn would bring improvement. And on the third morning, Clara's fever broke. The child woke with clarity in her eyes, her small hand gripping Eleanor's with renewed strength. "You remained with me," Clara said, wonder and gratitude mingling in her voice. "You did not leave me." "Never," Eleanor replied, and meant it with an intensity that encompassed far more than the fever. That evening, as Eleanor prepared to depart, the Duke intercepted her in the corridor. He looked disheveled, unshaven, his clothing bearing the marks of 3 days spent in proximity to illness and worry. Yet to Eleanor, he had never appeared more beautiful, more human, more real. "You have given me a gift," he said without preamble. "You have saved the child who has become precious to me. I find myself indebted in a manner that transcends the customary bounds of social obligation." "I ask nothing, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "Clara is precious to me as well. Her welfare is reward sufficient. But I wish to offer something," he replied, and withdrew a small box from his coat pocket. Within lay a ring, not ostentatious but exquisite, bearing a single sapphire of deep blue. "Not as an engagement," he said quickly, perceiving her expression. "That would be premature and would expose you to greater scandal than you have already endured. But as a symbol of my intention, when the time is right, when propriety allows, when I have ensured Clara's establishment and your reputation is beyond reproach, I wish to offer you not merely protection, but partnership. I wish to ask you to share your life with mine, Eleanor, not as a governess in my household, but as my wife." Eleanor's hands trembled. She could not accept, and yet she could not refuse. The ring represented everything that was impossible, everything that her heart desired beyond reason or prudence. "I cannot wear this openly," she whispered. "The scandal—" "I know," the Duke said. "Wear it where only you will know it. Let it be our secret, our promise to one another. When the time comes, the world will understand that what has transpired between us has been love pure and true, and nothing they might have whispered in the interim will diminish that truth." Eleanor placed the ring upon the chain that held her mother's small cross, hidden beneath her dress, against her heart, where it would remain a secret covenant between them. As she departed Harborough that evening, Eleanor understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. She was bound now, not by vows, but by something far more powerful, by love, by choice, by the absolute certainty that the Duke's silence had been shattered irreparably, and that her own life had been forever altered by the courage it had taken to speak truth to power. The world would soon demand that they account for themselves. But for now, in the winter darkness, Eleanor touched the ring hidden beneath her dress and allowed herself to believe in miracles. The winter assembly arrived with the inevitability of Judgment Day. The great ballroom of the assembly rooms had been transformed into a cathedral of candlelight and crystal, where the city's most respectable families gathered to observe one another with the intensity of naturalists cataloguing specimens. Eleanor stood at the periphery, her simple white gown deliberately modest, her sapphire hidden beneath layers of silk and propriety. Clara was extraordinary. The child had been dressed by the finest modiste in the county, her pale gold hair arranged with ringlets that framed her small face like a crown. The Duke had spared no expense, and the result was a transformation so complete that even Lady Montague had ceased to dissemble her amazement. Yet it was not merely the external adornment that commanded attention. It was the poise that Eleanor had nurtured through these months, the certainty that had bloomed within Clara as the fever broke and the spring approached. The Duke entered precisely at 8 o'clock, his arrival marked by the subtle shifts in attention that his presence always precipitated. He wore black evening dress with silver buttons, his cravat secured with a pin of dark stone. His gaze swept the room with practiced authority, and Eleanor felt her heart execute a peculiar rhythm when his eyes briefly found hers, before moving on with deliberate neutrality. Lady Agatha stood near the refreshment table, her expression a study in barely suppressed fury. The whispers had intensified to a roar over the past weeks, speculation about Eleanor's frequent visits to Harborough, theories about the Duke's intentions, insinuations that had gradually transformed from attack upon Eleanor's reputation to something more complicated. Society had begun to perceive what had transpired between the Duke and the Governess, and the scandal of it had become the primary topic of conversation in every drawing room. The music began. The Duke moved with deliberate purpose toward Clara, extending his hand with a gallantry that caused a visible stirring through the assembled crowd. He led the child into the first dance, a gesture so unprecedented that it seemed to reshape the air itself. For a Duke to partner with a girl of no particular family significance, to offer her the validation of his attention and his rank, It was a declaration. Eleanor perceived Lady Agatha's face transform into something resembling apoplexy. The woman's hand gripped her fan so forcefully that it seemed the ivory might splinter. As the dance concluded, the Duke conducted Clara back to Eleanor's side with a formality that suggested this was entirely a matter of propriety and responsibility. Yet, as he released the child's hand, his fingers brushed Eleanor's with a pressure that communicated volumes that his voice could not express in public. "Miss Clara has acquitted herself admirably," he said, his tone perfectly calibrated for any observer. "You have prepared her well, Miss Finch. The city will soon recognize what I have known for some months, that her character and accomplishments exceed those of many of far greater birth." Before Eleanor could respond, Lady Agatha appeared with the precision of a predator sensing wounded prey. "Your Grace," she said, executing a curtsy that was calculated to suggest both deference and wounded dignity, "I confess myself overwhelmed by the honor you have extended to my niece. And yet, I must speak plainly, as one concerned with propriety and the protection of young innocence. There are rumors in the city regarding the frequency of Miss Eleanor's visits to your household, rumors that have begun to extend to suggestions of impropriety. I wonder if you have considered how such appearances might affect the child's reputation, or how society might interpret your partiality toward a woman of her station." The ballroom seemed to contract around them. Eleanor felt every eye turn in their direction. The orchestra continued to play, yet the music seemed suddenly very far away. The Duke's expression did not alter. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question or hesitation. "Lady Agatha," he said, "I have observed your attempts to poison the reputation of a woman whose only transgression has been to speak truth with dignity. I have witnessed your efforts to diminish a child whose goodness exceeds your own comprehension, and I have become convinced that you are a woman whose moral authority is not merely questioned, but fundamentally absent." A sound rippled through the crowd. Shock, scandal, the delicious horror of witnessing rank rebuked publicly by one whose authority superseded all others. "Miss Eleanor Finch," the Duke continued, and now he turned directly to Eleanor, addressing her with a formality that transformed the entire meaning of the moment, "is a woman of exceptional character and unquestionable virtue. She has demonstrated a courage that society rarely permits women to express. And I am honored, profoundly honored, to announce that she has consented to become my wife." The world seemed to cease its rotation. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, her breath become something foreign and difficult. She had not consented. They had made no such agreement, had spoken only in metaphor and promise. Yet as the Duke reached for her hand, openly without the pretense of propriety, Eleanor understood what he had done. He had taken the scandal and transformed it into inevitability. He had made the choice between allowing society to whisper its poison or standing before them all and claiming her with the full weight of his authority and his love. "Your Grace," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "You cannot—" "I can," he replied, his storm-grey eyes holding hers with absolute conviction, "and I have. Unless you wish to contradict me before all these witnesses, I suggest you accept the reality that has just been declared." Eleanor looked at Clara, whose small face shone with wonder and understanding. She looked at Lady Agatha, whose expression had transformed into something resembling curdled vinegar. She looked at the assembled faces of society, shocked, scandalized, gradually beginning to comprehend that they had just witnessed not a scandal, but a revolution. "I accept," Eleanor said softly, and the words seemed to reverberate through the ballroom as though she had spoken them before thousands instead of hundreds. "I accept with gratitude and with love." The Duke raised her hand to his lips, a gesture so tender, so publicly intimate, that it seemed to complete the transformation of everything that had preceded it. The whispers that had been weapons became roses scattered at their feet. The scandal became vindication. The orchestra, sensing the shift in the room's emotional tenor, struck up a waltz. The Duke extended his hand to Eleanor, and without waiting for permission or propriety to dictate the terms of engagement, he led her into the dance. As they moved across the ballroom floor, Eleanor felt the weight of the sapphire ring hidden beneath her dress, no longer a secret, but a promise made visible through his proclamation. The silence that had once defined the Duke had been shattered irreparably, and in its place had come something far more powerful, the voice of love, speaking truth before the entire assembled world. Eleanor's simple white gown seemed to glow in the candlelight. The Duke's severe features had softened into something approaching joy, and when he whispered to her, "I could endure propriety no longer," Eleanor understood that she had not merely been offered protection or partnership. She had been offered the rarest gift of all, a man willing to sacrifice his carefully maintained dignity for the sake of authentic connection. The dance ended. The applause was thunderous, and Eleanor, who had once been invisible, was now impossible to ignore. Spring arrived with the certainty of a promise kept. The city gardens bloomed with the urgency of life renewed, and Eleanor walked through them as the acknowledged future Duchess of Harborough, a transformation so complete that it seemed to rewrite the entire fabric of reality. The engagement had precipitated a cascade of consequences that society had scrambled to accommodate. Lady Montague had become suddenly solicitous, her previous coldness transmuted into obsequious deference. The merchants who had once observed Eleanor with suspicion now addressed her with elaborate courtesy. The whispers had not ceased entirely, but they had been fundamentally altered. Speculation now focused not on impropriety, but on the improbable romance that had captured the city's imagination. Yet beneath the surface celebration, Eleanor perceived the currents of resistance. The Duke's family, a distant cousin who served as his primary relation, had expressed distinct displeasure at his choice. Letters had arrived in heavy cream envelopes, their contents heavy with disapproval, regarding his betrothal to a woman of no significant family, no considerable dowry, no social credentials beyond the accident of his affection. Eleanor had witnessed the Duke reading one such letter in his study, his jaw tightening with each word, his hands seeming to require deliberate control to prevent the paper from tearing beneath his fingers. When he perceived her presence in the doorway, he had set the letter aside with studied casualness. "My family believes I am committing an act of supreme foolishness," he had said without preamble. "They suggest that love is an insufficient foundation for marriage of this significance. They imply that you have somehow secured my affections through manipulation or witchcraft, any explanation except the truth, which is simply that you are remarkable, and I am no longer willing to pretend that rank supersedes the claims of genuine human connection." Eleanor had approached him then, and for the first time she had permitted herself to touch him without the mediation of illness or crisis. She had placed her hand upon his cheek and felt the tension in his jaw release beneath her palm. "They will come to understand," she had whispered. "When they perceive that you are happier than you have been in years, they will be forced to acknowledge that this marriage serves a greater purpose than propriety." Now, as spring deepened toward early summer, Eleanor found herself engaged in the elaborate rituals that surrounded the preparation for a wedding of such social significance. The Duke's estate was being prepared. Guest lists were being compiled with the care of generals planning campaigns. The modiste had created a wedding dress of such exquisite subtlety, white silk with embroidery of tiny flowers that seemed to bloom across the fabric like a garden imprisoned in thread, that Eleanor could scarcely believe it was intended to adorn her. Clara had become her closest confidant in these preparations. The child had been invited to remain at Harborough under the Duke's guardianship, an arrangement that had scandalized Lady Montague, even as she dared not object to such an honor. The girl had flourished in the care of both Eleanor and the Duke, developing a bond with him that had gradually transformed from gratitude into something approaching genuine familial affection. One afternoon in late spring, as Eleanor stood in the garden at Harborough gathering flowers for the house, Clara approached with a solemnity that suggested she carried weighty matters. "Eleanor," the child said, using the given name that she now employed only in private, "I have been wondering about something. When you marry the Duke, will you still be my governess?" Eleanor set down her basket and took Clara's small hands in hers. "I will always be your teacher, Clara, though the nature of that teaching may change. But more importantly, I will be your family. The Duke intends for you to be established as his ward in every legal sense. You will have a secure future, a place in his household that is guaranteed regardless of circumstance. Will you love him?" Clara asked with the directness that only children possessed. "I have come to love him very much. He is kind when kindness is not easy. He listens when listening is inconvenient. I would not wish him to be married to someone who did not cherish these qualities." Eleanor felt her eyes grow warm with unshed tears. "Yes, Clara, I love him profoundly, more deeply than I would have thought possible. He has shown me that love is not diminished by circumstance or social position. Rather, it is only genuine when it persists despite such obstacles." Clara seemed satisfied. She returned to her studies, but the conversation had crystallized something in Eleanor that required acknowledgement. She did love the Duke, Not the abstract ideal of him that had initially drawn her attention, but the actual man, his careful humor, his moments of unexpected tenderness, the way his severe features softened when he believed himself unobserved. 3 weeks before the wedding, the Duke had arranged for Eleanor to visit Harborough alone, a transgression of propriety so calculated that it could only be justified if observed through the lens of final preparations. Yet, when Eleanor arrived, she found him waiting in the library, the room where they had first spoken what now seemed like a lifetime ago. "I have something to show you," he said, and led her through corridors she had not previously explored. They descended into the depths of the house, to a chamber that had clearly been closed for many years. When he opened the doors, Eleanor gasped. The room was a library, but not merely a library. It was Eleanor's library, in every sense that mattered. The shelves held volumes on education, philosophy, literature, history, a collection that suggested someone had been deliberately purchasing books for a woman of intellect and curiosity. On the desk lay correspondence, letters written in a careful hand that Eleanor gradually recognized as belonging to scholars and educators of considerable renown. "When I learned who you were," the Duke said quietly, "I began to recognize that your education had been starved, constrained by circumstance. I have spent the past months acquiring the library that you should have been given from birth. This will be your domain, Eleanor. A space where your mind can flourish without limitation or apology." Eleanor could not speak. She moved from shelf to shelf, running her fingers across spines that represented entire worlds of knowledge held in suspension, waiting for her to claim them. "You have given me more than a library," she finally whispered. "You have given me permission to exist as myself, not as a governess, not as a wife, but as a complete human being worthy of intellectual companionship." "You were always worthy," the Duke replied. "Society simply required the intervention of love to recognize what should have been self-evident." He took her hand then and led her to a window that overlooked the gardens below. From this vantage point, Eleanor could see the entire estate, the ordered beauty of it, the sense of permanence and care that had been invested in every stone and every tree. "In 3 weeks, the Duke said, his voice carrying the weight of commitment, "I will stand before God and all assembled witnesses and pledge to honor and cherish you for all the days of our lives. But I want you to know now, in this private moment, that you have already transformed my life in ways I could not have imagined. The silence that defined my existence has been replaced by conversation, by laughter, by the possibility of genuine human connection. You have given me this gift, Eleanor, and I will spend the remainder of my life ensuring that you never regret the courage it took to speak truth to power." Eleanor turned to face him, and for the first time she permitted herself to imagine their future without the constraints of propriety or the limitations of social expectation. The ring that had been hidden beneath her dress was now visible upon her finger, no longer a secret, but a declaration. Spring bloomed around them, and Eleanor understood that she stood at the threshold of a life that transcended everything she had previously believed possible. Love, it seemed, was not merely a romantic ideal, it was transformation itself. The morning of Eleanor's wedding day arrived as though the season itself had conspired to mark the occasion. The sky displayed a clarity of blue that seemed almost unnatural in its perfection, and the gardens of the church had been adorned with flowers so profuse that they seemed to be attempting to reconstruct Eden itself. Eleanor stood in the vestry, her white dress luminous in the filtered light, her fingers trembling as her attendant, the modiste's daughter, enlisted for the occasion, arranged the final details of her appearance. Clara had insisted upon serving as Eleanor's attendant despite her youth, a request that neither Eleanor nor the Duke had possessed the heart to deny. The child now circled Eleanor with the gravity of ceremony, adjusting ribbons and ensuring that every element was positioned to communicate Eleanor's worthiness of the role she was about to assume. "You are the most beautiful bride I have ever witnessed," Clara said solemnly, "and I have seen illustrations in books of royal weddings." Eleanor pulled the child close, inhaling the scent of lavender that clung to her dark hair. "Thank you, my dear one. Your presence here means more to me than you can possibly comprehend." Beyond the vestry doors, Eleanor could perceive the muted sounds of the assembled congregation, whispers, the rustling of fine fabrics, the low murmur of voices executing the careful social calculations that preceded such momentous occasions. The entire city seemed to have gathered, drawn by the spectacle of the cold Duke's sudden transformation, by the scandal that had become vindication, by the triumph of love over propriety. Lady Montague was present naturally, her expression a mixture of satisfaction regarding Clara's elevation and lingering uncertainty about Eleanor's social metamorphosis. The Duke's family had reluctantly attended, their expressions suggesting they were participating in their own execution rather than a joyous celebration. The merchants whose stalls Eleanor had passed countless times had been granted positions of honor, a deliberate choice by the Duke, who had ensured that those of modest station were accorded respect equal to that granted to the most prominent families. The organ began to play, and Eleanor heard the congregation rise to its feet. Her heart accelerated to a rhythm that seemed to match the music, a slow, stately progression that was paradoxically both eternal and impossibly brief. She took her final breath as Eleanor Finch. In moments, she would emerge as the Duchess of Harborough. The doors opened, light flooded inward, and Eleanor stepped into the transformed world that awaited her. The aisle seemed to extend infinitely. A pathway through a forest of faces turned toward her with the intensity of judgment and anticipation. Yet Eleanor's vision narrowed almost immediately to a single point. The Duke, standing at the altar with a rigidity that suggested he was maintaining control through sheer force of will. He wore dark formal dress, his severity somehow emphasizing rather than diminishing the emotional tempest that seemed to be occurring beneath the surface of his composure. When her eyes met his, Eleanor witnessed the exact moment when his careful containment began to dissolve. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched momentarily before he deliberately relaxed them, and then, as Eleanor moved closer, his expression transformed into something so raw, so transparently devoted, that Eleanor felt tears begin to blur her vision. The vicar began the ceremony with the customary words, yet Eleanor heard them as though they were being spoken in a language just beyond her comprehension. She was conscious of the Duke's presence beside her, of the warmth emanating from his form, of the electricity that seemed to arc between them with each unguarded proximity. When the moment came for their exchange of vows, the Duke took her hands in his, and Eleanor felt the trembling in his fingers that suggested his emotional state was equally turbulent to her own. "I, Adrian James Blackwell, Duke of Harborough," he began, his voice steady despite the evident emotion beneath, "take thee, Eleanor Margaret Finch, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." The words were traditional, prescribed, yet the manner in which he spoke them transformed them into something entirely new. He was making a promise not merely to society, but to her, a vow that transcended the ceremonial and became a declaration of absolute commitment. Eleanor's voice was barely audible when she spoke her own vows, yet the vicar seemed to perceive the sincerity beneath the whisper. "I, Eleanor Margaret Finch, take thee, Adrian James Blackwell, Duke of Harborough, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, the Duke lifted Eleanor's veil with a deliberation that suggested he was unveiling a masterpiece. And then, in full view of every assembled witness, he bent and kissed her with a tenderness that contained within it all the passion, all the restraint, all the longing that had accumulated between them across these months of transformation. The congregation erupted into applause that seemed to fill the very vaults of the church, yet Eleanor heard it as though from a great distance. She was entirely consumed by the sensation of her husband's lips upon her own, by the moment when silence became voice, when propriety dissolved into truth, when two souls that had been separated by circumstance finally found their completion in one another. As they turned to face the assembled congregation, Eleanor's hand resting upon the Duke's arm, she perceived something shift in the emotional tenor of the gathering. What had been scandal was now romance. What had been transgression was now destiny. The cold Duke of Harborough, long thought incapable of human connection, had been revealed to be entirely human, vulnerable, devoted, transformed by the power of genuine love. That evening, as Eleanor was conducted to the bridal chamber in the Duke's ancestral home, she carried with her the knowledge that everything had changed. She was no longer invisible, she was no longer powerless. She was the Duchess of Harborough, and more importantly, she was beloved, genuinely, completely, authentically beloved. Yet beneath the joy lay a deeper understanding. Her transformation had been precipitated not by his rank or his wealth, but by the simple act of speaking truth. She had dared to break the silence that society had imposed upon women like her, and in doing so, she had broken far more than silence. She had shattered the very foundations of the world's belief in the immutability of class and propriety. As the Duke entered the chamber and closed the door against the outer world, Eleanor extended her hand to him, no longer tentatively, no longer obscured by gloves or protocol, but openly, with the fullness of her commitment visible for him to see and to honor. Their wedding night, when it came, was not passionate abandon, but something far more profound, the meeting of two souls who had been shaped by restraint and denial, finally permitted to express themselves through the language of the body, a conversation conducted in whispers, in tenderness, in the revelation of vulnerabilities held hidden from the world. And when Eleanor awoke in the darkness before dawn, wrapped in the embrace of her husband's arms, she understood with absolute certainty that she had not merely married a duke, she had married a man, flawed, devoted, transformed by the power of love into something far greater than title or position could ever convey. The silence had been broken, and in its place had come something beautiful beyond measure. 6 months had passed since Eleanor became the Duchess of Harborough, and the transformation had rippled outward from her private happiness into the very fabric of the estate's operations. The Duke had begun to implement changes that suggested his years of emotional isolation had been accompanied by a growing awareness of injustice within his own domain. The servants had been granted increased wages and improved conditions. The tenant farmers, previously subject to arbitrary demands, had been offered security through written agreements that formalized their rights and responsibilities. The schools that served the estate villages had been endowed with funds sufficient to ensure that children of all stations could receive education previously available only to the wealthy. Eleanor had initiated these changes through careful suggestion rather than direct advocacy, yet the Duke had adopted them with the enthusiasm of a man discovering his own conscience. He had transformed from a figure of austere authority into something more complex, a leader learning to temper power with compassion, to recognize that rank imposed not merely privileges but obligations. Yet not all aspects of his transformation had proceeded smoothly. Word had reached Eleanor that the Duke's cousin and primary family relation, the man who stood to inherit should the Duke produce no heir, had begun to circulate rumors suggesting that Eleanor was exerting undue influence over the Duke's judgment, that she was systematically undermining the family's interests for her own gain. It was an echo of Lady Agatha's original accusations, yet now it came from within the family itself, carrying the weight of authority that blood relation provided. Eleanor had perceived the concern in the Duke's letters from London, where he spent portions of each month managing his political and financial affairs. She had noted the tightness around his eyes when he returned from these sojourns, as though he carried weights that even her affection could not entirely relieve. One afternoon in late autumn, Eleanor sat in the library, her library as the Duke had insisted upon calling it, when a messenger arrived bearing an urgent letter. The Duke's handwriting was hurried, the words compressed with emotion held barely in containment. The letter informed her that his cousin had demanded a meeting with both the Duke and his solicitor. The accusation was formal. Eleanor had married the Duke under false pretenses, had systematically isolated him from family council, had engineered the changes to the estate's management in order to secure her position and ensure that any heir would be influenced by her interests rather than those of the family legacy. Eleanor read the letter twice, then placed it upon the mahogany desk with hands that trembled. The accusations were absurd, and yet they carried the potential to cause genuine harm. Society might forgive a duke for marrying a governess if love could be demonstrated as the motivating force, but if there was even the suggestion of calculation, of manipulation, of a woman exerting undue influence over a man's judgment and property, then everything would be reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. She had barely finished processing this revelation when the Duke himself arrived, travel-worn and clearly distressed. He moved directly to Eleanor and pulled her close, holding her with a fierceness that suggested he was reassuring himself of her continued presence. "The accusation is baseless," he said immediately. "I have not yet dignified it with a response, but I have returned because I will not engage in this matter without your presence and your voice. If my cousin believes he can undermine you through insinuation and rumor, he will learn otherwise." Eleanor pulled back to look at him. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to summon him here," the Duke replied, "and I intend for you to demonstrate, through your own testimony, the falsity of his accusations. You will speak your truth, Eleanor, just as you did in my library that first day. And the world, in the form of my solicitor, my household, and anyone else who requires convincing, will hear it. But your family, Eleanor began. My family, the Duke interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute authority of his rank, has had centuries to prove itself worthy of my consideration. You have had mere months to demonstrate a character of such sterling quality that it has transformed my entire existence. I will not permit them to diminish that truth through the currency of their disappointed expectations. 2 days later, the Duke's cousin arrived, a man of approximately 40, with the dissipated features that suggested a life spent in pursuit of pleasures rather than substance. He was accompanied by his solicitor, a thin individual whose expression suggested he was deeply uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. The meeting took place in the Duke's formal study, with Eleanor seated not as a supplicant, but as an equal participant. She had dressed carefully in a gown of sapphire blue that seemed to echo the ring she wore, and her bearing suggested she was entirely confident in her position. I will not dignify these accusations with extensive rebuttal, the Duke began, his voice colder than Eleanor had yet heard it directed at anyone, but I will clarify for the record several facts. First, my marriage to Eleanor was entirely my own decision, made deliberately and with full consciousness of her station. Second, the changes I have implemented at Harborough reflect my own judgment regarding how my estate should be managed. Third, I possess sufficient intellect to recognize when someone is advising me wisely, regardless of their social position. And fourth, any suggestion that my wife has somehow diminished my faculties is not merely insulting to her, but insulting to my own judgment. The cousin's expression had begun to shift towards something approaching desperation. Your Grace, surely you can comprehend how such a rapid transformation appears to the family. These changes to the estate, the expenditures on schools and improvements, they represent a departure from centuries of precedent. One might reasonably question whether, the Duke interrupted, whether I have finally begun to exercise my conscience after years of allowing it to atrophy. That would be a fair question, but one would not insinuate that my wife has somehow engineered my awakening to moral responsibility. She has done no such thing. She has merely demonstrated, through her own conduct and character, that there are virtues I had allowed myself to overlook. Eleanor perceived the exact moment when her husband's cousin understood that he had irrevocably lost this battle. The man's features sagged, and he turned to his solicitor with the expression of one who has encountered an immovable object. I will make this simple, the Duke continued. You may either accept my marriage and the changes that have accompanied it, or you may remove yourself from my consideration entirely. I will not provide detailed justifications for decisions that are within my absolute authority to make. I will not permit my marriage to be questioned, and I will not tolerate further suggestions that my wife is anything other than a woman of exceptional character and integrity. After the cousin and his solicitor had departed, their tails distinctly between their legs, Eleanor found herself alone with the Duke in the gathering darkness of the study. He moved to the window and gazed out at the estate that stretched before them, his shoulders bearing the weight of decisions that had not been easy to make. I have chosen you, he said quietly, not merely as my wife, but as my conscience. You have reminded me that power without compassion is merely tyranny dressed in fine clothes. I will not permit my family or society or anyone else to suggest that choosing you was anything other than the wisest decision I have ever made. Eleanor rose and came to stand beside him, placing her hand upon his arm. You have chosen rightly, but so have I. You have given me not merely a position, but a purpose. You have demonstrated that a woman of modest birth can be valued not for what she owns, but for what she contributes, what she believes, what she dares to speak aloud, despite the cost. The Duke turned to face her, and Eleanor saw in his expression a peace that had not been present before. The battle with his cousin, the vindication of his choices, the public demonstration of his commitment to Eleanor, all of these things had served to crystallize something that had been gradually forming throughout their months together. I love you, he said simply, not because you are the Duchess of Harborough, not because propriety demands that I love my wife, but because you are Eleanor, remarkable, courageous, true Eleanor. You have broken the silence of my life, and I will spend the remainder of my days ensuring that your voice continues to be heard. Eleanor felt tears trace down her cheeks. She understood then that their journey together had moved beyond the realm of personal romance into something far more significant, a declaration that love, when genuine, could overcome any obstacle that society might place in its path. The announcement came in spring, when the world itself seemed to be celebrating alongside Eleanor. She stood in the garden at Harborough, her hand resting upon her belly, feeling the subtle quickening that suggested life was beginning to flourish within her. The Duke stood nearby, his expression suggesting he was observing not merely his wife, but something approaching a miracle made flesh. "You are certain?" he asked, though Eleanor perceived the joy beneath the careful formality of his tone. "As certain as one can be," Eleanor replied. "The physician confirmed this morning. We will have a child, Adrian. A life born from love, from courage, from the breaking of silence that the world had imposed upon us both." The Duke moved toward her with the reverence one might employ in approaching a holy relic. He placed his hand beside hers, and they both felt the subtle movement that suggested their child was present, aware, beginning its own journey into existence. "A son or daughter," he mused. "It matters not truly. What matters is that this child will be born into a world where their mother is valued for her intellect, her character, her capacity for truth-telling. They will inherit both my name and your spirit, Eleanor. They will be remarkable." Over the months that followed, Eleanor witnessed the Duke's joy evolve into something approaching contentment that seemed to transform his entire being. He became more present in the household, less burdened by the weight of his position. The servants noticed the change, the way he occasionally smiled without provocation, the manner in which his interactions with Eleanor had become noticeably tender and unguarded. Clara, now nearly 14, had become increasingly sophisticated under Eleanor's continued tutelage and Madame Clarice's refined instruction. The girl had developed into a young woman of considerable accomplishment, her education eclipsing that of most girls of her age, her social skills refined to a degree that suggested she would make an excellent marriage when the time came. Yet what struck Eleanor most profoundly was the bond that had formed between Clara and the Duke. The child had come to regard him with a devotion that transcended gratitude and approached genuine familial love. When Clara learned of Eleanor's pregnancy, she had wept, not tears of sorrow but of joy that the family she had come to treasure would be expanded. "Will the child be my brother or sister?" Clara had asked, her hazel eyes bright with possibility. "In every way that matters," Eleanor had replied. "You will be their elder sibling, their guide, their protector. You will teach them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. You will show them that love transcends the boundaries of blood and birth." As autumn approached, Eleanor found herself becoming increasingly aware of the passage of time. The child within her grew stronger, more insistent, until there were moments when she could scarcely comprehend that she had ever existed in any other state. The Duke attended to her with a solicitude that transcended the customary attentions of husbands. He read to her from the books in the library that had become theirs, shared space that now contained evidence of their combined intellectual pursuits. He walked with her through the gardens, his hand never far from her arm, as though he feared that she might dissolve into mist if left unanchored. "I am terrified," he admitted one evening, his usual composure entirely abandoned. "Terrified that something will prevent this child from coming safely into the world. Terrified that I will prove inadequate as a father. Terrified that I will somehow diminish what you have already accomplished through my own inevitable failures." Eleanor had taken his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You will be an exceptional father because you care deeply about being one. You have learned, Adrian, that perfection is not the goal. Authenticity is. You have learned that love is not diminished by vulnerability. Our child will thrive because they will be raised by two people who have each other's true measure and cherish what they perceive." The night when Eleanor's labor began, the Duke was present, an unusual circumstance that scandalized the midwife slightly, though she remained professional in her response to his obvious refusal to be separated from his wife during this crucial moment. Eleanor's pain was intense, consuming, yet the Duke remained constant, his hand in hers, his voice speaking encouragement, his presence anchoring her to something beyond the immediate agony. When the child came, a daughter, small and perfect, and immediately possessed of a remarkable cry that seemed to announce her presence to the world, the Duke wept openly, his composure entirely abandoned to the force of his emotion. "She is extraordinary," he whispered, as the midwife placed their daughter into Eleanor's arms. "She has your eyes, your strength. She will be formidable." Eleanor gazed upon her child and understood with absolute clarity that everything that had transpired between her and the Duke, all of the struggle and courage and defiance of social expectation, had been leading toward this moment. This small life that now existed in the world was the ultimate vindication of their choices. "We will call her Margaret," Eleanor said, "after my mother, who taught me that dignity could survive even in the most constrained circumstances. She will carry forward the legacy of courage that brought her into existence." The Duke knelt beside the bed, his hand touching their daughter's impossibly small fingers with wonder and reverence. "Margaret Harborough," he said softly, "a new beginning for our family, a child born from love that defied convention. She will inherit a world that is beginning to recognize that merit transcends class, that character is more valuable than lineage, that a voice, particularly the voice of one deemed powerless, can reshape reality itself." As Eleanor drifted into sleep, her daughter nursing contentedly at her breast, she perceived the Duke remaining awake, watching them both with an expression of such complete devotion that it seemed to contain within it the entire arc of their journey. From that first meeting in his library, when she had dared to speak truth to power, to this moment when she lay crowned in motherhood, having transformed not merely a cold Duke into a man capable of love, but herself into someone entirely unexpected, the silence had been broken, and in its place had come not merely love, but a new world, one where courage was rewarded, where truth was honored, where a woman of modest birth could become not a decoration in a Duke's household, but the very center of his existence. Word count, 947 words. Epilogue, the legacy of love. 5 years later, the gardens of Harborough had transformed into something approaching paradise. What had once been merely orderly and well-maintained had become a space that seemed to celebrate life itself. Wild roses climbing trellises, herbs and flowers intermingled with deliberate abandon, children's laughter echoing through the pathways like music composed by the universe itself. Margaret Harborough, now 5 years old, possessed the peculiar combination of her parents' most significant qualities, her father's stern certainty in matters of principle, combined with her mother's gentle way of speaking truth without causing unnecessary pain. She could be found most afternoons in Eleanor's library, not yet able to read with complete fluency, but clearly possessed of her mother's hunger for knowledge and her father's determination to master whatever she encountered. Beside Margaret played a younger child, Thomas Adrian, born 3 years after his sister, a boy who had inherited his father's severe features and his mother's capacity for compassion. The children moved through the house with the freedom of those who had never experienced the constraints of rigid hierarchy, yet with a decorum that suggested they had been taught to value structure as a framework for liberty rather than as a prison. Eleanor watched them from the library window, her hand resting upon her forearm, as she observed the interplay between sibling affection and occasional discord. She had become, in the 5 years since her marriage, something that society had not anticipated. A duchess who maintained her intellectual pursuits, who corresponded with scholars and educators, who had used her position not to become ornamental, but to become instrumental in reshaping the educational opportunities available to children of modest birth. The school she and the Duke had established now served nearly 200 children from the surrounding villages. Girls were taught alongside boys, a radical departure from tradition that had initially scandalized the county, yet had gradually gained acceptance as the results became evident. Children of farmers and merchants demonstrated themselves capable of learning mathematics, languages, history, natural philosophy. Potential was not bound by gender or class, as Eleanor had always believed and had now proven through action. The Duke entered the library with the characteristic purposefulness that still, after 5 years, made Eleanor's heart execute an irregular rhythm. He had aged slightly, silver now more prominent in his dark hair, yet he seemed somehow younger than he had been before his marriage. The lines that had etched his face with perpetual gravity had softened. His stern features had learned to smile. "The family has arrived," he announced. "Your former employer and his wife have accepted the invitation to winter with us. Clara is with them now, showing them to their chambers. They appear quite overcome by the grandeur of their reception." Eleanor rose from her chair and moved toward him, taking his offered hand. Lord and Lady Montague had become gradually more reconciled to Eleanor's transformation, though neither seemed entirely able to comprehend how the governess they had once regarded with suspicion had become the woman who now hosted them in a Duke's household. "Clara has blossomed," Eleanor observed. "Do you perceive how she has become the woman she was always meant to be? When I first came to the Montague household, I wondered if her goodness would survive the cruelty of those who failed to perceive it. Now I see her standing confident, elegant, secure in her own value. That is perhaps my greatest satisfaction." to have witnessed her transformation and to have played a role in it. The Duke drew Eleanor close, his arms settling around her waist with the ease of long familiarity. You have transformed more than Clara, Eleanor. You have transformed me, my household, my understanding of what is possible when one refuses to accept the limitations society imposes. Every child who has learned to read in our school, every young woman who has discovered her own intellectual capacity, every servant who has been treated with dignity and respect, all of these transformations can be traced back to the moment you walked into my library and dared to speak truth. Margaret appeared in the doorway then, her small face turned upward with the directness of childhood. "Mamma, might we see the seal? The red seal that you have kept in the box." Clara asked about it, and I told her the story of how you gave it to Papa, but she desires to see it for herself. Eleanor exchanged a glance with the Duke. The sealed envelope, her original letter of plea, had been preserved with the care one might employ with a holy relic. It sat in a box of carved wood, locked but always accessible, a physical reminder of the moment when courage had transformed everything. "Come," Eleanor said, extending her hand to her daughter. "We will show Clara the seal together. It is a story she deserves to hear in full." As the three of them made their way to Eleanor's private chamber, where the sealed letter was kept, the Duke paused at the threshold and spoke with a quietness that suggested he was addressing the moment as much as his wife and child. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The courage it took to transgress against propriety, the scandal, the whispers, the uncertainty that attended our marriage." Eleanor turned to face him, Margaret's small hand secure in her own. "Never. Not for a moment. Because everything that has transpired, the pain, the scandal, the defiance of social expectation, has led to this. To a life where I am valued for my mind, where my voice is heard not with tolerance but with genuine interest, where my daughter can be raised knowing that she is worthy, not because of her birth but because of her character." She paused, and then continued with the kind of vulnerability that she had learned from the Duke himself, the willingness to expose one's deepest truths without fear of judgment. "And more than that, I have experienced love, Adrian. True love. Not the romanticized version that society peddles to young women as a reward for obedience and compliance, but the genuine article, a meeting of souls that acknowledges both the flaws and the luminous qualities of the other." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Eleanor perceived the subtle shifts in dynamics that had accompanied her transformation. Lady Montague, who had once regarded her with cold suspicion, now addressed her with something approaching affection, or at least with the recognition that Eleanor had proven herself worthy of respect. The Duke's cousin, still living on the estate but in markedly reduced circumstances, kept his counsel and his resentment to himself. Clara sat between Eleanor and the Duke, her youth now fully transformed into the early bloom of womanhood. She had become, in many ways, a younger version of Eleanor, educated, thoughtful, possessed of the kind of quiet confidence that came from being truly valued. "Miss Eleanor," Clara said. She had begun to revert to the formal address when in public, a courtesy that Eleanor appreciated. "I have been reflecting upon everything you have taught me, and I have come to understand that courage is not something one possesses innately. It is something one develops through the choice to speak truth despite the cost. You taught me that through your example." Eleanor felt her eyes grow warm. She placed her hand over Clara's, acknowledging the young woman's assessment. "You will pass this understanding forward, Clara. You will teach it to your own children, should you be blessed with them. You will demonstrate through your life that women need not accept the limitations society imposes. That is how transformation occurs, not through dramatic declarations, but through the quiet persistence of each person daring to be more fully themselves." Later that night, after the children had been put to sleep and the household had settled into quietude, Eleanor stood at the window of the chamber she shared with the Duke. The grounds of Harborough spread before her, illuminated by moonlight that seemed to render everything it touched into something approaching ethereal beauty. The Duke came to stand beside her, as he did most evenings, a ritual that had become as essential to Eleanor as breathing. They stood in companionable silence, each understanding that what bound them transcended the need for constant verbal expression. "I have been thinking," the Duke said finally, "about legacy, not in the conventional sense, not the estates and titles that will pass to Thomas, though those matter in their practical way. Rather, I have been contemplating what we will leave behind in terms of how we have lived, what we have valued, what we have dared to challenge. We will leave behind a world slightly more just than the one we inherited," Eleanor replied. "Not perfect, that is impossible, but improved." changed. Margaret and Thomas will inherit a household where women are educated, where servants are treated with dignity, where marriage is based on genuine partnership rather than transaction. And in the schools we have built, hundreds of children will learn that their circumstances at birth do not determine the limits of their potential. The Duke took her hand, raising it to his lips, a gesture so habitual that Eleanor barely noticed it, yet it still contained within it all the tenderness of his devotion. "You have given me more than an heir, Eleanor. You have given me purpose beyond the mere maintenance of rank and property. You have shown me that the cold Duke of Harborough was always merely a man waiting to discover his own capacity for warmth." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder and allowed herself to rest. Outside, the night stretched out in all its darkness and possibility. Inside, warmth and light and love had created a sanctuary that transcended the boundaries of propriety and class. The seal had been broken, the silence had been shattered, and in its place had come something that society could not replicate, could not commodify, could not diminish through whisper or judgment. Love, authentic, complete, transformative love. And the woman who had dared to speak truth to power had been rewarded not with the accolades of society, but with something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that her courage had changed not merely her own life, but the lives of everyone she touched, rippling outward in concentric circles that would continue expanding long after she had passed from this world. Margaret and Thomas would grow to adulthood with the understanding that love conquers all obstacles. Clara would raise children who believed that a woman's voice mattered, that education was not a luxury but a birthright, that the accidents of birth need not determine the trajectory of a life. And somewhere in a city school, a child born to a seamstress or a baker's son would open a book and perceive in its pages the possibility of transformation. They would understand, through the education that Eleanor had fought so fiercely to make available, that their circumstances were not destiny. That courage, when paired with truth, could indeed break the silence of the world. The legacy was not Eleanor's alone to claim. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by her refusal to accept limitation, her willingness to transgress against propriety in service of what was right, her absolute conviction that love, and only love, held the power to truly transform the human heart. The Duke held Eleanor close as the night deepened around them, and somewhere in the vast house, their children slept safely, secure in the knowledge that they were loved for themselves, valued for their character, and free to become whoever their courage and conviction would permit them to be. The seal, preserved in its wooden box, would eventually be discovered by historians and scholars. They would debate its significance, analyze the handwriting, speculate about the circumstances that had prompted its creation, but none of them would ever fully comprehend the true cost of its creation, the risk, the vulnerability, the absolute certainty that speaking truth to power might result in complete devastation. What they would understand, if they were perceptive enough, was this: that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is not strength or wealth or rank, but the simple, terrifying, necessary act of a woman choosing to be heard. And when that voice is met by a man brave enough to listen, brave enough to change, the entire world shifts on its axis, and nothing remains quite the same. This is the legacy of Eleanor and Adrian Harborough. Not in the grandeur of titles or the magnificence of estates, but in the quiet revolution of a love that dared to defy convention, and in doing so, transformed everyone it touched. The silence was broken, and the voice that broke it continues to echo across generations, teaching all who hear it that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act despite it. It is the decision to speak truth even when silence would be safer. It is the extraordinary bravery of loving authentically in a world designed to compel pretense. And that perhaps is the greatest truth of all. The courage that breaks silence transforms worlds. This story whispers to us across the threshold of time a truth that our modern world desperately requires, that authentic courage is not found in dramatic gestures or violent revolution, but in the quiet, terrifying act of speaking truth when silence would be infinitely safer. Eleanor Finch did not possess wealth, power, or social standing. She possessed something far rarer: the integrity to recognize injustice and the willingness to risk everything to address it. She did not demand change. She appealed to the conscience of another human being and trusted that beneath layers of protection, beneath walls constructed from years of emotional isolation, there existed the capacity for genuine human connection. And the Duke, bound by his own constraints, by the expectations of rank, by the weight of tradition, by the habit of emotional distance, discovered through her voice something he had believed forever lost to him, the possibility of authentic transformation. He learned that true authority lies not in the ability to command obedience, but in the courage to acknowledge error and the willingness to change one's fundamental understanding of how the world should function. Their love was not incidental to the transformation that occurred. Rather, it was the catalyst that made transformation possible. When we love someone genuinely, we are compelled to see them clearly, not through the distorting lens of social prejudice or the convenient fiction that class determines worth, but as they truly are. And when we are truly seen, we have no choice but to become more fully ourselves. The greatest wisdom contained in this narrative is this, that the silences we accept as inevitable are often merely the silences we have agreed not to break. Society did not prevent Eleanor from speaking. Eleanor's own fear, her understanding of what she stood to lose, was what initially compelled her silence. It was only when the stakes became unbearable, when remaining silent meant allowing a child to be diminished by cruelty, that she discovered she possessed a voice powerful enough to reshape reality. Every person reading this carries within themselves the capacity for the same courage. We live in systems designed to convince us that our voices do not matter, that our concerns are too insignificant to warrant expression, that the cost of speaking truth is invariably too high to justify the attempt. The world whispers to us constantly, accept the injustice you perceive, accommodate the cruelty you witness, silence yourself in service to social order. Eleanor refused, and in refusing, she did not merely change her own life. She fundamentally altered the trajectory of everyone around her. Clara became the young woman she was always capable of being. The Duke discovered his own humanity. The servants in the household learned that they were worthy of dignity. The children in the schools that Eleanor established learned that their circumstances at birth need not determine the limits of their futures. This is the profound lesson of her courage, that when one person dares to speak truth, it creates permission for others to do the same. The silence once broken cannot be restored. The world once questioned must justify itself, and the hierarchies we have agreed to accept become suddenly fragile when confronted by someone willing to challenge them in the name of what is right. We live in an age of unprecedented access to communication, yet we experience unprecedented silence regarding the things that matter most. We scroll through our devices consuming the carefully curated narratives of others, yet we remain silent about the inequities we perceive in our own lives, our own communities, our own spheres of influence. We have become expert at documenting injustice while remaining inactive in addressing it. Eleanor's story calls us to something different. It calls us to recognize that we need not wait for permission to speak. We need not achieve a certain status, accumulate a certain level of power, or attain a certain age before our voices matter. The question is not whether we are qualified to speak truth. The question is whether we are brave enough to do so. And here is the most beautiful secret that Eleanor discovered, that the cost of speaking truth is invariably less than the cost of remaining silent. Yes, there was risk. Yes, there was scandal, uncertainty, the possibility of complete devastation. But the cost of silence would have been the extinction of Eleanor's own authentic self. It would have been the loss of Clara's potential. It would have been the perpetuation of a system that valued conformity over character, obedience over truth. When we measure authentic suffering, the suffering of the soul condemned to perpetual insincerity, the suffering of the conscience forced to accommodate injustice, the suffering of the spirit that knows what is right but remains silent, we discover that it far exceeds the temporary discomfort of speaking truth and weathering the consequences. This is Eleanor's legacy to us, that we are more courageous than we believe ourselves to be. We underestimate the potential of our own voices because we have internalized the message that we should be silent. We accept constraints that have no objective reality, believing them to be inevitable because authority has declared them to be necessary. But Eleanor, standing before a duke with nothing but her conviction that what she was saying was true, nothing but her belief that a child deserved protection, nothing but her willingness to risk everything, Eleanor discovered that the walls that seemed so imposing were actually quite fragile. They fell not before military might or political power, but before the simple, terrifying, necessary act of authentic truth-telling. We are living in times that desperately require this courage. We are called, each of us, to recognize the silences we have accepted, the injustices we have learned to accommodate, the voices we have suppressed, both the voices of others and our own. We are called to become Eleanor Finch, ordinary, unexceptional, possessed of no particular power or status, yet willing to speak what is true and to trust that authentic truth-telling possesses the power to transform worlds. The seal was broken, the silence was shattered, and the woman who broke it was transformed from invisible to indispensable, from powerless to powerful, not through the acquisition of external authority, but through the simple, profound act of claiming her own voice and trusting that it would be heard. Dear viewers and beloved listeners of Victorian romance audio stories, thank you for journeying with us through the extraordinary transformation of Eleanor and Adrian. Their story is not merely a romance set in the drawing rooms and estates of Victorian England. It is a testament to the power of courage, to the truth that authentic love can overcome any obstacle that society might place in its path. We invite you to become part of our community. If this tale has moved you, if you have found yourself contemplating the silences you have accepted and the truths you have been afraid to speak, we would be deeply honored to hear from you. Please subscribe to Victorian Romance audio stories and join thousands of listeners who are discovering that romance is not merely entertainment. It is a mirror held up to our own hearts, reflecting back the possibilities that exist within us. Leave us a comment. Tell us which moment in Eleanor's journey resonated most deeply with you. Share with us how her courage has inspired your own. Discuss how you perceive the connection between love and truth-telling, between vulnerability and strength. Your comments enrich our community and create a space where we can collectively explore the themes that make us human. The voices of our listeners matter profoundly to us. We do not create these stories in isolation. We create them in conversation with you. Your engagement, your emotional responses, your insights, all of these things shape the stories we will tell in the future. Subscribe, comment, share. Help us build a community dedicated to celebrating stories of love that transcends convention, of courage that transforms worlds, of women and men who dare to speak truth, and in doing so, change everything. The silence is breaking. Your voice is needed. Join us.